Okay,
All right, here we are. Last discussion.
last one.
We made it.
Yeah.
All right. How does Mate use a developmental trauma framework to understand substance abuse?
Um, well, I guess I could start. This is like my I have this book, so I was just reading from the book. I read it for other classes and everything. I really like Mateo a lot, but I think it's pretty straightforward in the chapters we're given talking about like the emptiness you feel from like your attachment wounds and how um relating that to how you reach for external validation, and for like addiction that has to do with like substances or other frames of addiction uh, that he also mentioned a little bit of. But in terms of substance abuse, it makes a lot of sense to view it through the trauma-informed lens. And I appreciate him having that just because there's obviously a lot of reasons why addiction happens for people, but this is like a very like base level kind of I think the most human way to view it in a way is to see how things have developed from childhood. So yeah, I really appreciated the way that he framed it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. I noticed that there was only like one phrase, like one sentence at the very end of, I think it was the last chapter or towards the end of it. Maybe it was the second chapter where he mentions like peer things in adolescence can lead to substance abuse. And I think that's probably like one of the most common misconceptions about substance abuse is that it's just like, oh, you just get in with the wrong crowd and it's a choice, and the gateway drug like mythology of substance abuse. So I really appreciated how he like minimized that and really like centered the conversation around not just around substance abuse, but I mean his writing was in these chapters was a lot about just addiction in general. And he also talked a lot about, like you said, in terms of attachment, like attunement, in the last chapter. And I thought that was really an important piece to think about. And yeah, in terms of how it all fits into a developmental trauma framework, I think just looking at pretty much like any of like that's one of my big takeaways from this class is like pretty much looking at any disorder, substance abuse, whatever it is, like addiction, like looking at anything from a developmental perspective is so key because that's what not only like shapes our personality from like a outward perspective, but like, he talks also a lot in these chapters about the way that the brain is structured and shaped, how the neural pathways are shaped by what happens in early childhood and infancy. Um, so I think that's really crucial to bring into the conversation around developmental um, trauma and the relationship to substance abuse and addiction.
Yeah, you both said it really well. Some of the things that were standing out to me, I underlined like the last sentence of the last chapter we read. It says addiction is always a poor substitute for love. Um, and Amati really like takes us through, okay, what is like even giving his own story about what happened to him during his first couple of years of life and how like his mother's stress like contributed to his development and his addictive patterns, and like the instability that he had, but then how after like he had consistent caregivers, and relatively like middle class safe environments compared to I think it was the native man who was visiting in jail, who was consistently in like traumatic environments. Um, yeah, so he goes through like the brain and how the brain is affected. The attunement was important and how like not only like the ACEs, but even if a child doesn't feel loved or understood, how that can affect their development and their addictive patterns. Yeah, super interesting stuff. I was like, ooh, that hit a little too close to home.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when you went through the different like addictions like eating it, you know, just like all the different ones where I was like, oh yeah, that's true. Um,
Mhm.
I did appreciate, I mean, I guess we're probably gonna go into it for the second question, but how much he emphasized like paying attention to symptoms versus like actually like blaming the individual, like what comes to be from like the trauma versus like, you know, how that person, even though like they are, you know, doing their actions, doesn't necessarily mean that like it's coming from a place of control. So I think, yeah, that was something I really got out of the reading as well. And yeah, that last quote that you were talking about, Alex, was like, yeah, a huge one for me where I'm like, oh, I'll probably never forget that quote. So, um, yeah, very profound person.
Yeah. I also really the quote that he shared of another therapist that he quoted in his last chapter that said children swim in their parents' unconscious like fish swim in the sea. It's like, whoa, no, no pressure, parents. As a parent, I'm like, what's happening in my unconscious? But I think what he's pointing out with that quote is like, what he's talking about with attunement, where like a child can know that their parents love them, but like what all else is going on around them? Like, is the parent able to really attune to them? Meaning, does the parent show that can the parent really get the kid? Is the parent really understanding the kid and mirroring back to them? And um, I mean, I was honestly left with a lot of questions because I identified with a lot of what he was sharing, and I'm like, yeah, and I think probably we all have some addictions, like everybody, right? We've all got some. And so I was left feeling really curious, like I feel like, I grew up with all the things and my mom was both my parents, like especially my mom was very attuned and yeah, so I just feel a lot of curiosity. I'm like, why do we all have this then? Like why is we all have our own kinds of addictions and to an extent, some extent or another. And like, yeah, I was kind of diagnosing myself, but like with the question of like, but why? Like, I don't fit into these things, or like, I don't have this early attachment stuff. Like, just none of it, none of what he was outlining for the reasons why seemed to fit my lived experience. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people who, also have highly attuned parents and grew up with, little trauma or whatever, but like we still grow up to like be addicted to things.
I
I
thought it
think
was interesting, like, he was talking about like the voids and like what voids are those addictions feeding? Like what yeah, what is missing? What wasn't filled? And like uh I believe it said like it doesn't necessarily have to be in childhood, right? It can come from wherever, not feeling seen, not feeling heard, being maybe a little child and not getting enough um, like positive reinforcement. Depends.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, I think for me, not to be like on my soapbox or anything, but it's definitely like a big product of capitalism in my mind. And
Uh-huh.
also it really speaks to, which I know he doesn't, but for me, I think it speaks to how collectively we are like connected enough with our trauma that like we do feel the trauma of other people and that does affect us even if it's like subconsciously. So I think, and it is also good to speak on like these wounds can be triggered as adults, and it doesn't necessarily mean you had like abuse or trauma in your childhood, but there still might just be like a part of your inner child that does get affected by what happens to you as an adult. So that was something I always kind of think of when, people bring up like, well, I have an addictive personality, and it's like, well, for me, I think that's like not really a thing because it's like we all have our vices and everything. And I think that's putting too much like blame on the individual person versus like looking at the bigger picture of everything.
Yeah. It brings to mind like when he was bringing up like the lack of the village or like community
Mhm.
support. Um, yeah, all the pressure being on just like the primary caregivers and how that's not sustainable.
Definitely.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's real.
You guys want to go into the second question?
Yeah.
How do you fit this into your own trauma-informed framework for understanding both the diagnosis and treatment?
Sorry, I need to read it too because my brain. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, if someone's struggling with certain addictions or substance abuse, um, this helps me to sort of conceptualize their case in terms of really coming from like I'm thinking of like the ecological um framework. What was that? Like was that Erickson's
Ron, Ron,
Bron
Ron,
Bron
Ron and
Bron
Brenner, yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
like looking at the whole, like just like we were saying, there's the micro of the family and what's going on there, but like also looking at those all those like systems around and Mate also talks a lot about like the spiritual void and so in terms of thinking about treatment with somebody who is struggling with addiction or substance abuse, I think getting to, the root of where the voids are inside and like working there and like building strength and resource in self-esteem. He talks a lot about self-esteem in these readings and um yeah, which I just want to read this quote that he said because I think it was so great. Self-esteem is not what the individual consciously thinks about himself. It's the quality of self-respect manifested in his emotional life and behaviors. And so I think that's like something that I'll be considering in treatment, how to support people, how to support clients to strengthen the self-esteem where there's alignment between, what's happening in their emotional life and their behaviors. Because there's not, you can just help someone like eat less, in the story of, if he was talking about working with clients and obesity and explaining, how to eat, but that's not effective, right? Because there's a whole emotional life that's going on inside of that person. So anyway, those are my first thoughts about treatment, not so much about diagnosis, but I'll make some space here.
Um, yeah, I think it definitely fits for me, like I was saying earlier, like removing the symptoms from the person, just because I think it's so easy for someone to have like, especially in terms of like addiction, I guess. And I guess in general, but just like the weight of having the responsibility of having to fill like a void, and like Alex was saying, like doing that by yourself is so lonely and hard versus like having the support of someone that has like the trauma informed lens to understand that's like not possible and that it's not the fault of the person that it's not possible. Um So I think it's just very easy to be able to fit that into like my own like understanding with diagnosis, and especially as someone who doesn't like to pathologize people, and but also understanding it kind of goes like around, I guess, but understanding that diagnosis is part of treatment, and that's like a part of like the autonomy that a person has. And I know that's a big part of trauma informed care, is to make sure that the person has like a choice over their treatment, um as well as I lost my train of thought after that, but I'll let Alex go from here.
Sure. Um, yeah, so I think the trauma-informed care related to addiction and substance abuse aligns pretty well with my own understanding and framework. Like I'm a very much like a whole person centered kind of kind of guy. So not looking at just like a client's behavioral patterns, but also like what's like what Sarah and what you said, just like what's the void, like what what emotional work needs to happen for the behaviors to change. Where are like maybe some of the lacks in relationships or in psychoeducation or um, community, like what uh, for treatment, like how to get a person connected to both like their self-worth and then also um, their communities, I think will be important. And diagnosis, I'm with Liz. I don't like, and Sarah, like pathologizing isn't my thing. And I think trauma-informed care, like we said, like that's up to really the client, like what they need, and what fits right.
Yeah, I'm also just remembering a section where Mate was talking about incorporating mindfulness and like being in nature and like helping supporting clients to get connected again, like at the level of spirit, like at the level of like intrinsic self-worth,
Mhm.
and like oneness with life. It's not necessarily a trauma-informed framework so much as more of like a transpersonal framework, but that's kind of how I live and how I imagine I'll also work with clients.
Any last thoughts?
Um, I think bringing up like the impulsivity that is associated with addiction, it's important, and like addressing that probably in within the treatment would be good. And like how do you incorporate like a trauma-informed mindfulness-based approach? Um, yeah.
Right. Well, thanks, y'all.
Yeah.